Welcome to Some Good Tea, where we drink some tea and we share some tea. I'm your host, Katie, and today I am sharing some tea with my friend, Allie.
Hello.
Allie is a mutual friend, so we are friends with Hannah, and Hannah introduced us, and ever since then, we've both been like, oh my gosh, we need to have some tea. So we made that happen, which is super exciting. The tea that we're having today, this is I feel like it's a little bit of a guilty pleasure for me, because it's not the fanciest tea in the world, but it's delicious. This is Bengal Spice by Celestial Seasonings, and anybody who listens to this podcast who is a tea snob, I'm not a tea snob. I just like tea. Uh, and this is a very good tea. It's more of a like spicy tea, you know? It has a lot of earthy tones and stuff. I like to make it with a little bit of cream and honey. It's just lovely. It's absolutely lovely. And our topic today that we're going to be enjoying and sharing with is all about fairies and folklore and fairy tales, and I'm so excited to jump into this.
I love fairy tales more than anything in the world.
Yes, yes. We decided, was it like the first time we met or like the second time we were hanging out when we were like, oh my gosh, we have to
I
talk
think it was like the second or third. Um,
like that?
yeah, because then I told you about the fairy tales that I've been studying and how drastically different it is to study them than
Mm,
it is to hear about them or read them.
yes,
Yeah.
yes. Oh, so this is going to be really good. As per usual, we're going to roll our 20-sided dice, and that will determine what question we get. Allie, would you like to go first?
Sure. Okay. Here's my roll. 14.
14. Excellent. Ah, this is a really good introductory question. So, when you hear the phrase, this is a classic fairy tale, what story immediately pops into your head?
Classic fairy tales, whenever I hear that, I really just think of grim fairy tales as a whole,
Hmm.
considering that that's some of the most, I wouldn't say the oldest fairy tales that we have, but it's the oldest and the most well known. So the most well known of the oldest, I guess.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so all of those are considered what I consider to be classic. And then you have Perrault, who also would be classic, but not not really as classic as the Grimm brothers.
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. I very much feel the same. Like, if we were thinking about like specific fairy tales within like the Grimm fairy tales, like my brain all automatically pops to the ones that Disney has popularized
Hmm.
because of how much they've
Yeah.
popularized them. Um, I feel like a lot of people don't realize that they grew up watching some very like classic, well-known fairy tales through the medium of Disney.
Well, and I think what's interesting about Disney is that Disney created his own adaptation of all these stories,
Yeah.
which is how the tradition of storytelling progresses. You
Hmm.
have the story told in this region of the world, and then it's told this way in this region of the world. And then in another region of the world, it's this way. And then eventually it forms into an adaptation where you have Cinderella who has a donkey skin. And then
Yeah.
all of a sudden you have Cinderella who rides in a pumpkin. And then you have Cinderella who is looking for Prince Charming in Disney. And you have all these different things that equate and grow into the next phase of human society. Basically it adapts with the way that we view the world, and the stories adapt to how we see them.
Yeah. I think that's one of the things that I love so much about folklore in general is that you can really see, depending on which iteration you're looking at, you can really see the cultural influence at the time,
Mhm.
the things that they were trying to emphasize or the things that they left out, and how that changes not only depending on what language were these people speaking, but like what was the time period, what was seen as like a good story then versus a good story now, and that
Mhm.
thing.
Oh,
That's fun. That's really fun.
yeah. I think you hit right on the dot with that, because one of the coolest to look at is Little Red Riding Hood
Oh,
because there's
yes.
so many adaptations of Little Red Riding Hood. And you have when Charles Perrault was writing all of his, or Perrault, people
Hmm.
pronounce it differently.
That's okay.
When he was writing his fairy tales, he always attached a moral at the end of them, which
Yeah.
alluded to some really Christian themes that some people agree with or disagree with. But you see some of that creep up in the Grimm fairy tales as well. But there's others. There's one from Africa.
Mm.
Um, I forget its name. I have it right here though. I have my
Oh, look at you, so prepared.
on hand because I just love all of this so much. So we have the most popular version. So the oldest version of the Little Red Riding Hood.
Hmm.
Yeah, Little Red Riding Hood.
Yeah.
It's called the story of grandmother. And Little Red ends up almost getting eaten by an ogre instead of a wolf,
Yeah.
which is odd. But then you have this tale. I'm not going to try to pronounce it, but it's from Africa. Uh,
Hmm.
and the wolf is a cannibal instead of a wolf. And
Ooh.
the mother is warning her to not wander off the path or leave her home because she's going to be eaten by cannibals. And what does she do? She opens the door to the strangers, and the
Mm.
cannibals kidnap her and take her. And so it's so different from what we know from our
Very
Western
different.
version and from the European version, but it's the same story.
Hmm. Yeah. Very, very different. And like that hits so differently hearing like, oh, this is a story about other humans that might consume this small child. Like that hits very differently.
Yeah.
Even just me hearing that, than oh, there's a wild animal out in the woods that might consume this small child who's wandering around, right? Like
Yeah.
it's very differently and would probably land very differently in pop culture now if somebody heard that story versus like the classic Little Red Riding Hood.
Yeah.
So it's just so interesting to me how much those stories can change and what's changed and what's tweaked and what's not.
Yeah.
I think folklore and fairy tales can teach us a lot about ourselves and like who we are as people and how our culture can influence and change us over time. Um, but yeah, I that what a great start. We could keep talking forever, but that's what this is
Oh,
for.
yes.
Um, let me roll the dice and see what question I get next.
Hmm.
Ooh, that is a 12. Okay, so getting a little bit more specific. Fairies, little people, creatures that have wings, strange, beautiful beings known for being mischievous. They can be more malicious and darker in some folk stories, while others, especially their portrayal nowadays, usually shows fairies as being wholesome and sweet and pretty. Do you prefer one depiction over the other?
Well, I think had
Yeah,
you
go
asked
ahead.
me
Go ahead.
6 months ago, sorry.
No, it's
If I'm able to interject,
yes.
um, if you asked me 6 months ago that question, I would have said, "Oh, I like the happy-go-lucky fairy way more." But
Yeah.
I now that I've studied fairy tales more in depth, I've realized that they're one and the same. It just depends on what mood they're in, and it also just depends on what they understand. And there was um there was a I can't remember if it was a Sleeping Beauty or a Cinderella story, but the fairies went to go see it was Sleeping Beauty. It was a
Mhm.
Sleeping Beauty story. I think it was from
It's probably Sleeping
Italian,
Beauty because there's a lot of fairy stuff in
so much
Sleeping
fairy
Beauty.
stuff.
Yeah.
Um, I think it was the Italian version of Sleeping Beauty. I could be wrong. I would have to check my facts. But the
Okay.
fairies are running to help her and see her and give her all these gifts because they love her. And one trips on the ground and her gift turns into a curse.
Oh,
And
okay.
that changes the whole story and that changes her whole life and everything about it because now she's cursed.
Hmm.
And there's all these different things that feed into it. Did the fairy feel bad? Did she not feel bad? Was she even aware that she
Is she
cursed
being
her?
malicious? Yeah.
Yeah, because she tripped and fell. And I think that fairies and in general can be both good and bad, just like us. We can be both good and bad depending on our day, depending on our mood, depending if we've eaten yet.
Yeah. Yeah. I love that explanation so much. I think like I I don't know, for me in like especially like in how they are portrayed in like pop culture and that type of thing, just like you think of like a little pixie um
Hmm.
in a cute little dress and like poofy wings that's just happy all the time and magical or whatever. Um I don't like that portrayal quite as much because I think it misses what you hit on, where we kind of created these stories to explore and tell things about ourselves that might be hard to look at otherwise. And so having a creature that's complex and multidimensional, just like people, um, overall, I think is more useful in storytelling, but also more interesting, um, because it makes you think more about yourself and the people around you and the experiences that you have. Is it fun just to have like pretty, playful, silly fairies? Like, yeah,
More than
absolutely.
anything.
Oh
That's all
yeah,
I want to be is a fairy in
yeah.
a pretty dress with wings.
Of course, of course. But yeah, I think overall, like for like me, for like a satisfying story, I like there to be that like darker element and the question of, well, was this really a good thing or was this really a bad thing? Are they truly malicious or are they just mischievous
Hmm.
or were they misunderstood? Because those are questions that I think we can have about ourselves and other people. And it can help us to reframe the way we look when our stories help to reframe the way we look at different situations.
Hmm.
Um, but yeah, I mean, I like the Fae kind of in general.
Oh, yes.
It's great. It's
I
great.
love
It's
Faye.
weird and crazy, and I don't ever want it to miss that element of mystery about it. Um, I have a lot of family heritage from like Ireland, Scotland area, and so there's a lot of things of like, oh, the little folk and the fairies and the leprechauns,
Hmm.
and they're not always nice. They're not
No.
always good. Sometimes they are, sometimes they're not, but there's definitely an element of we just don't know
Hmm.
about them. And I love that.
Yeah.
That just element of mystery of this other that is different from us, but similar, and can be really creepy, but then also be very silly at the same time.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
yeah,
Love
that's
it.
that's my answer to that
I
question.
love it. I think especially historically,
Yeah.
like it just adds so much beauty to elements of what could be.
Yeah. And I think that's important too in thinking about like how is like the Fae portrayed nowadays? Like, well, I think it's okay to portray them however you like,
Hmm.
right? However your story is going to develop. Because that's how those stories were started originally. It was what those people thought and
Hmm.
what those people felt.
Yeah.
So it's just like a continuation of it.
Yeah.
But would you like to roll the dice again?
I would love to roll the dice. Okay, I'm gonna roll it over here this time.
Let's see what you get.
6.
Hmm, 6. Going down to the single digits. Okay. Who or what culture do you feel like does creepy fairy tales the best?
Hmm. I think, okay, in a sense, I think that there's creepy fairy tales in every culture, especially now that
Oh,
I've read a lot of them. But I
oh,
think the creepiest one to come out of several different cultures
yeah.
is the fairy tale Bluebeard. Do you know much about Bluebeard?
That sounds like crazy familiar.
Okay.
I would swear I've probably heard some
It's
stories about Bluebeard.
terrifying. I think when a lot of people think of creepy fairy tales, they often will mix generally known fairy tales
Hmm.
with Bluebeard because we see, oh yeah, well, Grimm Fairy Tales was always so creepy. Not always. A lot of their stories are not as creepy as some people give them credit to, but Bluebeard and the Fitcher's Bird are
Mm-hmm.
terrifying.
Ooh.
Or the Robber Bridegroom, which is another Grimm fairy tale.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that one, and that one is the premise of the story is that we have a man who is hungry for a wife, and
So
he
we're starting out really well.
really well here
Very
and
good.
gets himself a wife. Depending on the story, there's lots of different ways. In one way, he throws an elaborate party to show that he is worthy of a wife. In one, he pretends to be a beggar and he kidnaps a wife. Yeah. In
Oh
another,
God.
he I can't remember the other one I was going to, but in all these other elements, oh, another one, he is engaged to her and is trying to convince her to come to
Oh.
his house before they're engaged. And
Oh.
she's like, I don't know about that,
A
dude.
bit.
Yeah, seems weird. But ultimately, she discovers she's there, and only in one version does she has she not married him yet. In all of the other versions, she's already married. And she goes and she discovers that he has had several wives before her.
No, I do know this. It's yes, I know
Probably it's probably coming.
know
Everyone
this.
knows it, but we
Oh
just
my
don't
gosh.
know it.
Oh, it's so good. It's so good. Keep going.
And they're all murdered.
Yeah.
And in the Fitcher's Bird, which is I think my favorite, which is a Grimm fairy tale, um, it's her sisters who he's married before. And so she sees the dead bodies decapitated, torn apart, their blood spilled into this cauldron. And she sees what's going on and she's like, oh no, I have to save them.
Yeah.
And she finds a way to save them. In the other versions, she drops a key
Hmm.
and the key becomes stained with blood
Yeah.
and she can't get it clean. And so he knows
She
and
went into the room and saw.
she sees everything. I think one of the creepiest ones, it's by Angela Carter, who does a whole bunch of more modern fairy tales.
Hmm.
I think she was writing it about the 80s or 90s. But it's the creepiest one because it's a more modern day
Hmm.
telling of Bluebeard, and she discovers that he was into um like binding and torture, and then
Yeah.
he took it too far.
Yeah.
But all of those stories, no matter where they come from, whether they're Arabic, whether they're European or Asian, they
Hmm.
are so terrifying. And I think a lot of people, we know that story, like you said, like you know it.
Yeah, no, I remember hearing that one on another podcast that I highly recommend. There's one that's called Myths and Legends, and it kind of
Mm,
does more lighthearted versions of stuff, but we'll sometimes get into like the creepy weeds. And then there's one called Lore, which is well known by people. They had an Amazon show of one of their
mhm.
seasons, like absolutely spectacular if you like creepy stories. And yeah, yeah. From both of those, I'm familiar with Bluebeard and just so I think the reason why it's scary is because it plays on the idea that you just don't know.
Mhm.
You don't know people until you know, and then you know too much.
Yeah.
In the couple versions that I've heard, it was like he left on a trip. They had
Yeah.
this beautiful marriage. He left on a trip, and there was always a room in the house that he was like,
And the
"Don't
jangling
go in there."
keys.
Yeah,
Yeah.
don't
Every
go
key.
in there. Like, please just respect my personal space. Like, that's my secret. You can go anywhere you want, do anything you want, but please don't go in there. And
Mhm.
she got too curious or whatever and was like, I'm just gonna peek. I'm just gonna look. And that's
Which
when
I mean, who wouldn't?
I mean, honestly,
I
that's kind of a
would.
red flag. Like,
Yeah.
if we're
Like
being real, that's
it's
kind
like
of a red flag.
modern day, don't look at my phone.
Yeah.
Okay,
Why are you looking
well,
at my phone? It's like
why are you looking at my
now
phone?
I need to look at your
Like,
phone because why
why
are you
should
hiding it?
I?
Yeah.
Exactly,
Yeah.
exactly. There was Margaret Atwood did a story
Mhm.
called Bluebeard's Egg, and
Ooh.
it's probably the least creepy version of Bluebeard, but it's this woman who's just like, wow, my husband, he's so sweet and naive, and he never notices when women hit on him, and oh my
Aw.
goodness, look how
He's
cute he is.
such a wholesome soul.
Yeah. Meanwhile, he is a heart surgeon, and so he's doing exams of women's breasts all day.
Oh no.
And she's like, oh, I can't believe he just doesn't even realize that he's around women's breasts all day.
He's just a little innocent
He's
being.
just
Like,
so innocent. And nothing. And then the end of the story, she discovers that he's having a full-blown affair with her best friend. And
Oh,
she had no idea, and she catches them intertwined
oh
in
no.
not completely intertwined, but just down the hall,
Yeah.
close off kind of a thing.
Yeah.
And she's just like, that had to be a mistake. And she talks herself out of it. And she's like, no, I saw something. It's
Like
nothing.
there's no way that it was actually him.
Yeah, no, it
You
was
had
just
this whole idea.
awkward. Yeah. And it's just one of those things where it's like, I think that that really tells the story today because we see so many men and women who are in relationships where they think one thing about their partner and the opposite is true. And I think from an outside perspective, we see that and
Yeah.
we're all like, red flag, red flag, red flag,
Yeah.
stop doing that.
Yeah.
But we don't. And, on the other side, you're in this happy marriage and you can go anywhere you want in the house, but just don't open this one door and you're completely fine. And it's like, well,
Oh, okay, whatever. It's probably a storage closet anyway. Like
yep.
I feel like that same mindset, like as an outside perspective, like watch any horror movie, right? There's
Mhm.
always the scene of the person going to the place where they shouldn't go, and there's a
Yes,
creepy sound and it's dark, and you're like, don't go there. It's so obvious you're gonna get killed, you know?
literally.
But the reason why like horror is so scary and so ridiculous is the same reason why that story can be so scary and so ridiculous because like in the moment, yeah, you can be that blind.
You
You can
can.
absolutely be that blind and people can be that good at hiding it and
Mhm.
sinking everybody into this
Mhm.
facade that they put on. And so yeah, that's an excellent choice for like a
Creepy
really creepy
story.
fairy tale. There's
Any
none,
blueberry story.
yeah, anything that's based off of any of those tellings of Bluebeard, very
Mhm.
creepy.
Uh,
Super, super creepy.
I can't stop reading them though. As much as I want to.
Yeah,
I can't
yeah.
stop.
I that's why I like the lore podcast so
Yeah.
much because it's so creepy.
But it's like,
Um,
oh,
Yeah, it's just a little bit like, ooh.
I'm gonna
But we
keep my
like
lights on
that.
tonight.
Yeah, we like that. We get that little bit of like, ooh, that's creepy. You're just gonna
Yeah.
leave all the lights on. And I think that's why folk stories and fairy tales often have that element of like mystery and creep
Mhm.
vibe to them because we love that. We love that.
As a side note, we can move on to another question, but as a side note, there's a very popular version of Sleeping Beauty. I think it's by Charles Perrault. Let me just double check that. I have it all highlighted and everything.
Oh, look at you being such a good student.
I love
That's
I
so great.
I think Sleeping Beauty was the most interesting one I've studied. Um,
Sleeping Beauty, let me just say, that's a messed up story.
it is well, actually, it's not that messed up. As a side note, I that's why I'm so fascinated by it is because of the oral storytelling and
Hmm.
how it changes and adapts according to how our perspective today.
Hmm.
The most messed up thing about it is in Charles Perrault's version, she's happily married and it's a wonderful, happy story until she meets her mother-in-law, who's an ogre, and then decides to eat her and her children.
Yeah.
And I'm like, whoa,
Like, whoa,
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 whoa.
plot twist much. Like, whoa,
Yeah.
calm down. Yeah.
Disney, you didn't include that part.
Like, excuse me, this was missing. Yeah,
So
yeah.
weird.
That's so fun. You rolled the dice that time. Now it's my turn.
Yes.
Let's see what we'll get. Probably, oh, we got a 17.
17.
Tell me about one of the weirdest folklore creatures you have ever heard about.
I have to think about this one.
Yeah. I can tell you right now that I feel like in the realm of like bizarreness, um, any of the yokai
Mm,
from Japanese folklore and like any Asian folklore, the yokai are weird.
I don't even think I know much about the yogai.
Oh my gosh. Okay.
Tell
Okay.
me. Spill
So
the tea.
I will spill this to you. For anybody who doesn't know, uh, in like Asian folklore and stories and stuff, We would call them like it kind of translates to demon. But it's not the like horns and tail kind of demon. It's just the like weird vibes creature,
Mm.
right? So, and there's tons and tons and tons of different ones. And they all have like kind of like their weird thing that they do, or that they are, or that they look like. And a lot of them are malicious. Usually if they pop up, there's something bad's gonna happen to the like main people in the story. Um, but some of these creatures are just kind of weird and like not necessarily harmful. They're just kind of there. In one of my other podcast episodes, during Halloween, we ended up talking about one of these critters that's um its sole purpose for existing is to go and cheer up sad, lonely drunks. Um, yeah, and it's weird. It's just it has a face, like it has no head and has a face in its belly, and it just goes around and dances and
That's
finds
amazing.
people in the middle of the night to try to cheer them up. So so the yokai are kind of like that. There's things like the butter cat. I don't know if you've ever heard of the butter cat.
No.
The butter cat's a yokai that steals your butter.
Wait, okay, okay. So could this be like the fairy that goes around stealing your left sock?
Basically, yeah,
Kind of
that's
the same
like
thing,
that.
same
They
principle.
kind of fulfill the role of like fae for that culture, right? So they have like,
That's my favorite kind because then I
oh
can
my
blame
gosh,
them for my like if
yeah,
I something, oh my gosh, I forgot to make dinner tonight.
yeah,
Yo guy, I'm gonna say
it was the yokai, yeah, and
I need
like
to research this
some
now.
of them are nasty, right? Some of them that might curse you, they might be the cause of like different diseases or things or bad luck. They're often associated with being omens and stuff like that. But then
Mhm.
others are just weird. And I like them all. I
That's
like them
funny.
all. And I think it's because it kind of shares that same niche as the Fae, as being like kind of really bad, but kind of not, and just very strange. Just like very, very strange critters.
I like that. Man, okay. I'm now just thinking about yogai and how much I need to look them up. Can you repeat the question?
Yeah. Basically, like tell me about one of the weirdest folklore creatures that you have heard about.
Okay. Originally, I'm honestly thinking of Avatar: The Last Airbender.
Ah,
I love Avatar.
I don't know
Um,
if that counts, but I'll let it count.
that's what I was thinking. I was like, I don't know if this counts, but oh, I just watched this episode the other day, but now I can't remember. No Face,
Oh
where
my,
he steals everyone's faces.
yes.
That literally weirdest creature I've ever of, heard
There's
of.
there's a yokai like that.
So creepy. But I
Yep.
think in what I've
Very.
been studying, the weirdest one is in Beauty and the Beast.
Ooh.
Um, I can't remember. I think it's also an Italian version. The
Hmm.
Italian stories of these fairy tales are so interesting. But in this one, um, the prince is a pig, like an actual pig, like
Oh my gosh.
honk running around, but he's also the prince. And so no one's really
Oh,
doing anything to really keep him in a pen. He's just roaming free around the
you
kingdom.
just
And
let him like do his little pig thing.
yeah, and he
Live
comes
his
back
best pig
every
life.
day. Oh my gosh, it's awful.
Wow.
And there's these three sisters, again, always sisters.
Always.
And the first one who marries him is like, ew, disgusting. You just ruined my dress. I hate you.
He's a pig. So.
Yeah, so she plans to kill him, and then he, with his hooves, claws out her eyes and kills her.
Oh my gosh.
And I think and he does the same thing with the second sister, but the third sister, she's like, oh, okay, here, you're my husband now, pig. And she lets him onto her dress and he destroys the whole thing. And she's like, this is my life now.
Like
And she's,
I'm fully married to a pig now.
except that she climbs into bed with him. This is my life now. Weird, weird.
Okay.
But then in that moment, he's like, you're not gonna murder me. And he transforms into this beautiful prince and they live happily ever after.
Aw.
And
Aw.
but I think that's the weirdest one. That's probably the most uncomfortable I've been reading a story. Like, ah, this is
I mean, yeah.
like
Yeah.
he's just a pig.
He is fully just a pig.
fully a pig, and
I like
he
that.
the hooves and the eyes. That's ugh.
Just yes.
Ugh.
There's I don't know if we'll get to this question, but there is like a unusually large amount of like descriptive violence in some of these fairy tales where it's like very specific.
Yeah.
That's a great example of like, yep, this pig totally just like went for her eyes. Like, why are you so specific?
Okay. My professor actually commented on that in the
Yeah.
class I was taking. She's one of the most brilliant women I know.
Oh,
And Professor Shigley, Weber State, she's amazing.
shout out to Professor Ripley.
I love her. Or Shigley, sorry.
Shigley.
Shigley, yeah. She explained that these fairy tales came from the oral storytelling tradition.
Hmm.
And she said oftentimes it was the lower class people peeling potatoes, shucking peas, and needing to stay awake while they worked because they had to
Oh,
work
snap.
20 hours a day.
Yeah.
And so they would tell these stories kind of like you do in elementary school, where each person gets a sentence.
A little bit like telephone, and you just make it weird
Yeah.
as you go around. I mean, yeah, why wouldn't you do something like that?
Why
That's so
wouldn't you?
fun.
And so these stories often started that way. And she said that it creates this sort of fairy tale logic
Yeah.
where, oh my gosh, why are we getting so much description on the hooves and the eyes? Well, that's because the person whose turn it was to tell the story thought it would be funny.
Had to like
And
one up people, had to make it
yeah.
more ridiculous, had to make it more crazy.
And
Yeah.
that's why you get things like Cinderella's shoe didn't fit anybody else except her. That's weird.
Yeah, that's
Right?
super weird. Like,
It's this fairy tale logic.
yeah. It's like I have feet that are hard to fit shoes to, but I know for a fact that there are people who can fit into my shoes
Yeah. And I
because
know I have small shoe
I go, yeah, you go to the store and I can't find my size because somebody else bought it. Like,
size. That was always the most illogical thing about Cinderella to me. And that is why I love Gail Carson Levine's Ella Enchanted more than life itself.
so great. That's so great. Ugh, awesome. I think we have time for like one more question.
Okay,
Do you want to roll the dice?
sure. 11.
11. This is a good one to wrap up with. What makes something folklore or a fairy tale? Is it its age? Is it its origin? Is it the weirdness that we were talking about? When do we start calling something like fiction versus lore?
Okay, I
Yeah.
love this question.
Thank you.
I think like we talked about earlier, it really depends on our perspective and how we're interpreting it ourselves and what our environment is and what that means to us. And I
Mhm.
think Sleeping Beauty is actually a really great example of this. Back in 2020, there was this song that was released about how awful the story of Sleeping Beauty is and how it's kind of trigger warning rapey.
Yeah, a little bit.
And I was like, that's honestly what made me so interested in studying fairy tales in college.
Okay.
And it turns out there is probably one out there, but I have not been able to find a version of Sleeping Beauty where she is assaulted.
Oh, I can help you with that, honey.
Please do, please
Okay.
do. And
Yeah.
what
Uh,
I what
yeah.
I've discovered is that in a lot of them, the 100 years ends right as
Mhm.
it comes. And as I've been studying a lot of the different versions, a lot of different things, I've realized that folklore adapts so much. So we have the Grimm version, we have the Perrault version with the ogre mother-in-law.
It's weird
Both of
mother-in-law.
those, yeah, in
Yeah.
both of those versions, she wakes up as the prince approaches her.
Yeah.
And then we have the Disney version, which so many of us know. And I was thinking, I was like, well, we have the continued oral storytelling.
Mhm.
And that is something that's become really important to us is, you know, consent and things that are appropriate and age appropriate, especially because she was young. She was like
Yeah.
15.
She's a small child. Yeah.
She was a
Versus
small child.
like, okay, now she's actually an adult. Yeah.
Yeah. And from my perspective, it's adapted into something that we can use today to say, oh yeah, like if you're sleeping and someone tries to kiss you, that is a big no-no. And that's become our own folklore today, something that we teach our children with, some that we tell each other, like, no, this is what's right and this is what's wrong. And I think that that also goes back to Little Red Riding Hood.
Yeah.
how moral first started with it being like, don't go in the woods by yourself. Like you're literally going to get killed because
Mhm.
you have no weapons. And then it adapted.
Who knows what's out in the woods?
Yeah,
Probably monsters. We don't know
we don't
how
know.
science works. So, like, good luck.
Yeah, exactly. And with Charles Perrault, that's when we got the moral of like, beware of creepy men. And
Yeah.
it keeps adapting. And I think that that's what folklore is. It's something that means something, whether it's morally, safety wise, or a life lesson, however we adapt those, that becomes folklore. So I think that Barbie is 100% modern day folklore in that sense.
Oh, beautiful. Yes, I love that you brought that up because I think about a lot of things in pop culture or stuff that's been
Mhm.
around. Like, think about the Marvel
Oh
universe,
my gosh,
right?
yes.
Think about
Loki, the perfect
DC.
example of Faye.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. But
Yeah.
just think about like comic books, right?
Mhm.
And they've been around for so long, and now we have this new telling of them in film and TV shows. We have cartoons, we have the whole Marvel Cinematic Universe that's like continuing the story.
Yes.
And I feel like things like that, like even things like Harry Potter and things like that
Oh,
are
100%.
very much becoming uh our modern folklore that in 100 years, 200, 300 years, when they look back, they'll be like, yeah, here's this like weird thing. And they told these crazy stories with these superpowers and a doll that could talk and like all of these
All
weird
these weird
things
things. And Harry
that
Potter will be synonymous with Star Wars because the stories will blend and become the same. And
they're essentially the same, but they're both
Mhm.
great.
Yes.
I think it's so interesting that we can kind of look back and see how it's going from like a little comic that you read as a kid, maybe, or a TV show that you watched on Saturday mornings to something that's so deeply culturally influential now.
Mhm.
Like Barbie was a toy you played with, but now like it's evolved.
Now it is lore.
Yeah.
Barbie world is
Yeah.
real.
Beautiful. Absolutely beautifully said. And I think that's, at least when I look at it, that's the difference, right?
Mhm.
Between something that, oh, this is like a fictional story, versus like our cultural lore. It's almost like it needs to have been around. It needs to
Mhm.
have been retold and built on and changed and adapted and had other hands in it, and then it goes from being like a single entity, one story, one time, to almost being a living, breathing thing that grows with the people that tell it.
And then we have adaptation and adaptation and
Yeah.
adaptation. And I love all of the new versions of fairy tales that we get today because I think that it continues the story, it continues the development.
Of that story
Mhm.
and that lore.
Yeah.
Yeah. I
No
think
longer is Cinderella a passive creature who just does what she's told. She has heart and feeling, and she is courageous, and she is kind, and she is
yeah,
a person. Yeah.
she becomes more and more human, and like just as much as somebody could have related to Cinderella when they were reading that story as a little kid from a grim fairy tale book, we still can relate in different ways to
Mhm.
watching that movie.
Yeah.
And I love that you bring that up, that you like that there's still this retelling, because I think with our modern media consumption, people often, they either feel really positively about remakes,
Hmm.
um, and retellings, or very negatively, and there's just kind of nothing in between.
Oh,
Um,
I love all of the remakes. I
yeah,
love Star Wars remakes. I love Avatar: The Last Airbender remake. I love
big,
Percy Jackson. My husband hates me for it. He doesn't. That was
big,
extreme. He does not, but he does not like all of them. I love them.
yeah.
Adaptation is an important part of our culture. We need it.
Yeah. And like there is definitely something to be said for like, okay, was this a well done film?
Hmm.
Right. And like we could talk about that forever
Oh
and
yeah.
be opinionated about that forever. But I think just when you look at it from the perspective of this is all of ours, this story belongs to all of us and we can take it and build it into something else, and that makes it live and breathe and adapt and grow with us, then
Mhm.
all retellings are a good retelling because it's just another branch on this tree that we have as a culture.
I think that the greatest form of that, or at least the one that's been able to do that the most successfully, is Jane Austen movies.
Oh, oh,
We
yes,
could do a whole nother podcast on that. I have
yes.
600 copies
Oh
of
my
her
gosh.
books and countless essays. But each of those films, they have their own characteristics, their own values, their own emphasis,
Hmm.
and they create an adaptation that is unique in its own. And I think that when it comes to fairy tales, that's the way that they should be told, is
Yeah.
it's unique concepts, it's unique, moral, it's unique outcome
Hmm.
or whatever, because that's why we keep going back to them, is because
Yeah.
it's different and it's new, but it's the story that we love.
Yeah. There's an element of familiarity, right? Of nostalgia because you had this as a kid or whatever, but then there's an element of this is what I need now. This is the vision that I need to see now. This is the moral that I need to take out of this now. And taking a step in another direction.
Mhm.
Still the same story, just a new step.
Yes,
Yeah.
love
Yeah.
it.
Ugh. This has been such a good conversation. Like, I am so glad we finally made time to do this.
I've been wanting to do this for so long, and I'm so glad that it finally worked out and the stars aligned.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Unfortunately, this is all we have time for today, guys, but we will talk at you later.